Terrific. Hello everyone, my name's Mandy Graham. I'm a member of the events team at Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, which is a small but very energetic group of grassroots activists, and we campaign for urgent climate change and also improving economic and social justice for Australians. I'd like to welcome you this evening to our Monday night Zoom talk, one in a series that's sort of started at the beginning of last year. And tonight we're featuring Professor Sarah Wheeler. Sarah has generously volunteered her time to speak with us this evening. Thank you, Sarah, about water economics and the policy that was supposed to return environmental flows and rejuvenate the Murray Darling Basin, but has failed miserably, leaving a system that is being drained to the last drop. But before I introduce Sarah, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kaurna land on which we meet this evening, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the sovereignty of the land was never ceded and that this land was and always will be Indigenous land. And for anyone who's joining us from outside Adelaide who might be on different Indigenous land tonight, if you could perhaps pop that in the chat and say good day and tell us where you are, that would be excellent. Before I begin too, I'd like to introduce Gabby. Most of you know Gabby, but she's our wonderful Chief Organiser at Sustainable Prosperity, and she's going to be the tech wizard this evening. So if you've got any problems, you can just message Gabby in the chat. Also, if you've got a question, you can type that directly in the chat as we go along, because we'll be pausing for some questions later on. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Wheeler. Sarah is a Professor of Water Economics in the School of Economics at the University of Adelaide. She was born on an irrigated dairy farm in New South Wales, and she grew up on a dryland mixed farm at the top of the Great Dividing Range in the New England region. This might explain her interest in agriculture and the management and mismanagement of one of the world's most precious resources, water. Sarah studied economics and graduated with her PhD in 2007. She was an AARES Future Fellow from 2014 to 2018, and she's a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. She has over 125 peer-reviewed outputs in the research areas of irrigated farming and climate change, the Murray Darling Basin, organic farming, water markets, water scarcity, mental health, crime and gambling. She works and has worked as an editor for 5 different journals, including the Australian Journal of Water Resources and a special issue of Agricultural Water Management. She's worked as an economist both nationally and internationally for Rural Solutions in South Australia, for ESCAP, United Nations in Bangkok, the Environment Agency in the UK, and also the South Australian Centre for Economic Studies. She is also the immediate past president of the Australasian Agricultural and Research Economic Society. Sarah, I'm sure we're all very keen to hear from you tonight and hear your view on what has transpired over the last decade to put the Murray-Darling in such a precarious position. And especially we'd like to hear about what we might do as activists to move the people with power in the right direction and quickly. So over to you, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Mandy, and thank you for inviting me to come talk to you all today. I wish it was in person. I wish a lot of things were in person these days, but unfortunately we're on Zoom. But, you know, this is also nice. I can see a lot of your faces. So thank you for tuning in to listen to me talk this evening. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. All right, good. Now I'm happy to take questions as I go along, or else just save up the questions to the end. If you put them in chat, I might not see them, but yeah, so however's easiest. If you usually ask questions as you go along, I'm happy to be interrupted. But tonight I've been asked to talk about my work within the Murray Darling Basin. And in doing so, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview. I know most of you probably know a lot about the Murray Darling Basin Plan and water policies, but some of you may not, and it might be good for others to have a bit of a refresher. So in terms of you know, why are we worrying about water? Well, I think if you live in Australia, we know very well why we're worrying about water, but, you know, water is a growing issue. You know, 10 years ago, it wasn't so much on the radar, but with growing climate change issues and predictions of variable supplies, increased temperature, reduced rainfall, you know, water stress by a variety of countries is growing around the world. And you know, climate change is one of our biggest challenges, and along with that will come the need to address water scarcity. And water scarcity is going to be felt by different regions, different people at different times. And as a water economist, one of my jobs is trying to understand, you know, what's the best way we can deal with water scarcity? What are all the policy options that are available to us? Water is so much important, you know, even though these goals, for example, the Sustainable United Nations Sustainable Development Global Goals, and even though the #1 goal is no poverty and #2 goal is no hunger, water underpins pretty much every sustainable development goal. And it's a number of goals in itself. So, you know, water is obviously very, very important, and knowing how to manage it, especially when you live in a area that has highly variable supply, is incredibly important, and it's only going to become more important as time goes on. So if we come to the Murray Darling Basin, just bearing in mind that world picture, and that world picture kind of showed us that Australia is an area of highly variable supplies and conflict. One of the most biggest areas of water conflict within Australia is the Murray Darling Basin. Now, the Murray Darling Basin Plan, it's often known as the food bowl of Australia. It has the majority of our irrigated land. It produces the majority of our food. Most of the food and agricultural products that are produced are exported, but it does support the population of Australia, and there's about 2 million people that live in the basin. The basin is an incredibly large area. It's an interconnected, hydrologically connected area. So you have the Darling River in the north. When there is enough water in the Darling and it is connected, these waters can flow right to the bottom of the River Murray, which is the Coorong and the lower lakes. And I think some of you may be in that area who are here on the call tonight. So, you know, it has the biggest river systems. It has over 30,000 environmental assets. It has a number of Ramsar listed, really highly critically important wetlands and environmental areas for the bird species and other ecosystems around the world. So it's very important. And from a cultural point of view, it has numerous First Nation groups, and it's culturally, it has a number of very important Indigenous sites. So let alone all the tourist and the recreation and the other production that goes on within the basin. So it's a very important area for Australia, and this is one of the reasons why we've seen so much conflict that we have within the basin. So this graph is highlighting the reason why we've seen conflict over water supplies within the Murray Darling Basin. This is just a measure of water inflows over time, over the last century. It's a very good indication that in some years we have lots and lots of water. We have floods within the basin, and other years we have hardly any inflows at all. You can also see that the red lines increasingly within in the last 10, 20 years, there's an increased risk of drought and decreased inflows within the basin. And unfortunately, it's predicted that those sort of reduced inflows are only going to increase in the future. SARO pretty much predicts that with climate change, that there's going to be an average 10% drop in inflows as a result. So this sets the scene for increased conflict over water within the basin. In terms of, you know, what's happened, what has water policy done in the past 100 years within the basin, from the 1900s onwards to 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was in what is known as a very much supply expansionary policy. So there was a whole lot of dams built, storages built, with the idea is that's how we could, you know, drought proof the area. That's how we can manage our water supplies. So overall, there was a 10-fold increase in capacity of major dams between 1940 and 1990. Now, all this increased supply had many advantages, but it also had disadvantages in terms of reducing, especially in times of highly variable and reduced rainfall, reducing water available for many users, especially downstream. This graph is highlighting, you know, along with that 10-fold increase in dam storage over that decade, we also had a significant increase in the amount of irrigated land. So this is land where farmers are either taking water directly from rivers or they're taking it from groundwater sources, but they're more likely to be taking it from surface water rivers, and they're irrigating land. So they might be doing it through old technology like flooding the area, or they might be using drips or sprays, etc., to irrigate land. So this is highlighting over the last 100 years, we've had a significant increase in irrigated area. In terms of trying to manage and knowing that the Murray Darling Basin goes over 5 jurisdictions, you know, it goes from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT into South Australia. You know, all states are going to want to get their own share of water. And in South Australia, which is known as the downstream state, they also have fought continuously for their own kind of share of Murray Darling Basin water resources to basically stop all the upstream states taking as much water as they want. So just in the last century, the biggest kind of water reform that's gone on after the 1901 Constitution was 1940, the River Murray Commission is when all the states got together to try and have an agreement over how the water resources in the basin would be shared. And that agreement has lasted for a long time, even though there's been lots of kind of debate and continual argument over it. As we've already kind of talked about, the 1900s saw an expansion in dams and storage and supply management, which ended up leading to a lot of environmental problems and water scarcity issues, which were then tried to be addressed. By 1987, the Murray Darling Basin Commission was put in place to try and manage the basin's water resources. In the 1990s, we saw the caps on diversion. So trying to actually start saying, well, we can't just keep giving out water licenses to everyone who asks for it. We can't keep increasing the amount of irrigated land. You know, we have to start putting a cap on how much water can be taken from our rivers and from our groundwater sources. We also started moving away from supply management in terms of, you know, just building dams to try and solve our water scarcity problems, to actually more demand management approaches. And what I mean by demand management is things such as starting to price water, starting to try and educate and change people's behaviour, putting water markets in place. So we've started trying to do a lot more demand management from the 1990s onwards. We still got into trouble with drought, etc. And in the 2000s, there was the National Water Initiative and the Living Murray First Step. In the mid-2000s, we had the Millennium Drought, and this is where we saw the Commonwealth Water Act enacted, and the Murray Darling Basin Commission was converted into the Murray Darling Basin Authority. It was given more powers, more staff, and charged with the idea of trying to come up with sustainable water extraction across the basin. You know, all this led up to the development by the Murray Darling Basin Authority of the 2012 Murray Darling Basin Plan. Now I can see chats, nope, okay. I'm just making sure there was no questions there I had to answer. Moving on. So in terms of when I was talking about the demand management initiatives that have been put in place in the basin, water markets have actually been around for a long time if you think about informal water markets. So there was reports during the World War II drought, which was a major drought. This is when irrigators started swapping water between themselves. So it was an early water trade that was happening. We also had states from the 1980s onwards putting in temporary trade, allowing temporary trade for irrigators to, again, swap their water between different accounts. And formal water markets and reforms. This is when we talk about the National Water Initiative and the COAG reforms from 94 onwards. They started developing ways of developing water markets within the Murray Darling Basin. So it was another way of trying to work out how can we share a scarce resource and how can we make it more efficient and have benefits from it. So the figure is kind of highlighting before water reform, water was very much bundled with land. And after the National Water Initiative reforms, we started separating out the right to water as separate to land. So it could be moved around the basin within a given set of rules. So I've already touched on the Millennium Drought, which sparked off what we know as the biggest water reform within the basin to date. I'm sure all of you on this call know of the widespread devastation that the Millennium Drought actually brought for many ecosystems and people right across the basin. It was a terrible, terrible time. And I think this picture just kind of sums it up of some of the consequences for animals of the Millennium Drought that actually happened. So because there was such widespread environmental degradation, this is what drove the biggest water reform to date that's happened within the basin. So, you know, we know that the Water Act was enacted in 2007. The authority was created. And one of the aims of this was to basically just to, get water back from a consumptive use, which is an irrigator use mainly, towards the environment. It was recognised that the environment needed a lot more water. So the way it was kind of planned was the Water for the Future program in 2008. It was initially a John Howard plan. It was known under a different plan, a different name at that time. But the concept was the same. It was, throwing a lot of money, over $10 billion over a series of years, to basically try to get water back from irrigators who were willing to give up water, and either through selling their water directly. This is under the Restoring the Balance program known as water buybacks. So they either sold their water directly back to the Commonwealth, or they swapped their water for a grant to be able to upgrade their water infrastructure subsidies, for example, which could then hopefully be a bit more productive on their farm and increase their water use efficiency. And that's the other way. That's the two main ways that it was the program was put in place to try and get water back for the environment. So the authority, which was charged in the Millennium Drought of trying to work out, well, how much is the system over allocated? How much do we have to pull back from irrigators to give to the environment? They released what is called the Guide to the Murray Darling Basin Plan in 2010. They started that plan basically said, we think that anywhere between 3,000 to 4,000 gigalitres should be returned to environmental use. So this was a large amount, but it's also worth knowing that some scientists were saying, well, up to 7,000 gigalitres actually needed to be returned. So it was actually it was kind of what was known as a mean to median amount that could have been a lot higher at the time. So these pictures are highlighting what happened after the authority released the guide to the Murray Darling Basin Plan. The top photo is irrigators in Griffith burning the guide, and there was huge protests regarding, it was just way too much water to be returned from irrigators to the environment, and there was considerable complaints. As a result, by the time that the authority actually legislated the actual Murray Darling Basin Plan, the target had been considerably reduced from the 3,000 to 4,000. It was minimum that was suggested to 2,750 gigalitres. So this was if you look at it, it's around a third, a 27% reduction was recommended, was what was needed to go back to the environment. To stop for the South Australian government to stop them going to court to say it was not enough. For the SA government, we do, as a downstream state, we experience most of the impacts of water scarcity. There was an additional 450 gigalitres granted on top of the 2,750 that was to be recovered through infrastructure investment only. So the total water recovery was brought up to 3,200 gigalitres. So that's the Murray Darling Basin Plan. So that was to get it legislated and passed in 2012. So I've talked a little bit about the history, and I'm not going to go everything into this slide because it's a big slide. This slide is just to show you that, the Basin Plan came into effect in 2012. It came in the midst of a lot of fighting. And there is so much in the timeline as the water reform that happens from that point on. In 2026, there is to be a review of the Basin Plan, and that's the point at which the authorities say they will reassess that current amount, the 3,200 gigalitres, which we'll talk a little bit about that later, but they'll reassess that point as, is it enough? Is there needs to be more? What's the impact of climate change? And what's the potentially new target for water recovery? So in terms of trying to understand, as a water economist, I'm often said, well, is the Basin Plan worth it? If all we hear about is irrigators complaining about rural communities losing jobs, losing production, the huge cost of it. We don't necessarily hear about what is the benefit of returning water to the environment. And I think it's really important to emphasise that, there was considerable amount of studies done on what would be the benefits of, returning water from consumptive to environmental use. These figures, it's not important to go through the actual detail, but it's important to note that, there are huge benefits of returning water to the environment. These things, it includes tourism, floodplain agriculture, recreational commercial fishing, boating, reducing salinity issues, reducing risk of blackwater events, health reasons, let alone all the cultural, spiritual and environmental benefits, which, as environmental economists, we try and put values on this, but it's some values, especially cultural values, that you can't actually value it. But it's known that those sort of benefits outweigh the costs that are involved from reducing water in irrigated production. So we know that some of the costs are, you reduce regional production, you forego agricultural profit. We also know that the Commonwealth is incurring lots of administration costs, etc. But once you kind of, do an analysis and balance some of the benefits against the costs, bearing in mind there's loads of benefits we can't actually value, the benefits outweigh the costs at least 3 times to 1. In that sense, for every dollar that you invest in trying to return water to the environment, it has a payoff of at least $3. And it's quite hard for those sort of values to often be known by the public, because often local stakeholders and irrigators, etc., you only ever hear that they're losing out from the Basin Plan. You don't actually hear about the people who are actually benefiting from it, because there's so many people and they're spread out, versus that the people who are losing are very concentrated group of people who get a lot of press about it. So this is some of the press that we hear a lot about the Basin Plan. You know, that it's destroying towns, it's ripping rural communities apart, that it's you know, causing jobs to be lost and rural communities to be devastated. You know, and we all don't want rural communities to suffer. That's something, you know, we all want rural communities to be strong and healthy. And so when you continually hear that the Murray Darling Basin Plan is causing all these problems, of course, that's something that lots of people worry about and they don't want to happen. So that's part of the reason why that we've been in a situation that it's believed that Murray Darling Basin returning water to the environment is such a negative policy. The reason that when I often talk about this, I highlight that, you know, rural communities are right to feel disgruntled. They're right to feel, many of them are to feel that, you know, things are going backwards and things are getting worse. This graph is highlighting, so the kind of the green line is hiding the amount of states in Murray Darling Basin states, the number of farmers. So we have been on a declining trend of the number of farmers and rural population in many areas. Education, health services have all gone backwards. And many people associate that decline in rural populations or farm numbers. They associate that with the introduction of the Murray Darling Basin Plan, because they go back 10 years and say, well, since the plan has been in place, we've lost X amount of farmers and we've had people moving out, and all the pain gets basically placed on the plan as the main reason for their hardship. However, this graph is kind of highlighting that, well, actually rural communities, they're on a long-term trend decline. And, you know, associating a plan that was only introduced 10 years ago as the continual reason for it, it's not the prime reason. You know, there are so many reasons why rural communities are suffering, but unfortunately, especially within the basin, the plan has ended up as being the scapegoat for all. The blue line here is just highlighting water diversions in the basin over time. And again, what it's showing is there is actually no direct association between how much water rural communities are extracting and how many farmers there are. So there's multiple reasons why farmers are leaving the land. So all that background as to, you know, why people are so upset with the Murray Darling Basin Plan and all the argument has, you know, politicians have really believed that, or they've chosen to believe that the Murray Darling Basin Plan and returning water to environmental use has hurt many rural communities. So as a result, I call it the 1,000 cuts to water reform. So the Basin Plan, I mean, from the time of the guide being introduced in 2010, with the plan legislated in 2012, we've just been on continual cuts to water reform ever since. So there are so many things that have happened, and I've just put some of them on this slide. But, you know, we've gone from, we cut the Sustainable Rivers Audit. So, you know, in terms of trying to measure how the environment is doing, the Sustainable Rivers Audit was a really brilliant program that did so. Well, that got cut. So we've cut it, so we can't actually really now tell what's happening in many places. We've gone away from buying water directly through water entitlements to subsidising irrigation infrastructure, which is a lot less efficient and more harmful. We've capped the purchase of water entitlements. The water portfolio moved from the Department of Environment to Agriculture, and then got sidelined even further. States, wherever they could, they changed water sharing plans and tried to always change rules in favour of irrigator versus the environment. The National Water Commission, that was disbanded in 2015. That was a very good independent federal commission commissioning very important water research. It reigned in 2015. It was thought we didn't need it anymore and it was disbanded. Inadequate monitoring, metering, enforcement, compliance. In all those, the decade after the Basin Plan, it's been enforcement and compliance has really gone backwards, and it's only been recently in New South Wales that situation has turned around. 2017, the Murray Darling Basin Authority did an amendment on the plan, and unfortunately what that means is that even less water is actually now going back to the environment. They are nowhere even getting close to the 3,200 gigalitres that was planned for in 2012. 2019, they decentralised the authority to regions, again trying to decrease the importance of the authority. 2020 and 21, again, the ministers are pledging absolutely no more water buybacks. And that's just some of the cuts to water reform. This graph, I'm not going to spend much time on this graph. All the point I want to make by this is it's kind of a bouncing process if you think about water reform over time. And if you get a really, really big reform up in water, it's often quite common in the years following that the reforms can go backwards. They might not completely go back to pre-reform, but they do go backwards. And this is happening probably every time we put up a big water reform. So I'm going to touch briefly on the common belief that buying water directly from irrigators is harmful and it hurts both production and jobs. So the academic literature, of which some of I've contributed to, is that there is actually no direct proportional relationship between water and production. That there's there's so many things that farmers can do on their farm to deal with less water that actually doesn't reduce their farm production at all. So it's not harmful in that sense. Also, when farmers also do sell water, they often have surplus and buffer water, hence they're not actually changing their production at all. And selling water often allows a debt reduction and allow farmers to pay down debt and to restructure or exit their farms. And the belief by lobby groups and many vocal stakeholders that irrigators don't want buyback and don't want to sell their water to the environment. It's actually not true. When we've done surveys, 40% of them do prefer more market-based water recovery options than irrigation infrastructure options. So in terms of, what's the impact of spending lots of money on water irrigation subsidies as the only method we are now using to recover water in the basin? Well, first of all, it's a huge opportunity cost. So, if we're only using irrigation infrastructure from now on, so this graph is highlighting, the blue is highlighting the volumes of water obtained through buying water directly from irrigators, and the gold is highlighting the volume of water from subsidising irrigation infrastructure. So you can see that we were mainly buying water directly up to 2012, and then after 2012-13, we were pretty much only subsidising irrigation infrastructure. So for a start, subsidising through irrigation infrastructure is like 3 times more expensive. So there's a huge opportunity cost, first of all, and it has a huge amount of negative externalities and negative impacts. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but some of the problems with trying to use irrigation infrastructure as the only way to get water back for the environment means that we change irrigator behaviour, we reduce return flows, We have governance problems because these programs have to be a lot more complex, and there's a lot of issues with corruption and transparency. There's equity issues, there's resilience issues, a whole heap of things that are problematic. That's just on top of the fact it's at least 3 times more expensive than buyback, and it's getting more expensive over time. In terms of the belief that if we use irrigation infrastructure, that it's really good for the local economy, this is just not true as well, because there's been a lot of economic modelling to say, well, if what we worry about is rural communities being strong, then what we need to do is spend money on things such as education and health, because that will create 3 to 4 times more jobs than the same amount of money spent on irrigation infrastructure. So it's a very poor way to deal with rural development if that's the prime motivation for subsidising irrigation infrastructure. And as part of the whole plan, there's been, there's been very little money actually spent on structural adjustment and proper rural development policies, which is a problem because that's the main issue that rural communities have concerns about. I'm not going to talk about the rebound effect because I don't have much time, but basically when we subsidise irrigation infrastructure, it can end up increasing water extraction as well. And part of the problem with understanding human behavioural impacts from increased extraction is knowing about how good our water accounting is. So if we think about water extraction across the basin, how are we monitoring it? Do we really know where, when and how water is being used? Unfortunately, if we look at how water is being measured, there's so many different ways that water extraction can actually exceed what is meant to be the sustainable cap limit. So we all probably know about theft of surface and groundwater resources. This is still going on. New South Wales particularly, as they're getting better at monitoring surface and groundwater, they're often regularly finding, whenever they do a check, that 1 in 10 users are taking perhaps a lot more water than they should be. So that's a significant amount, and those checks have only really started being put in place lately. We also know that how water is measured is often inaccurate and it's missing. We just don't monitor a lot of it. We don't measure a lot of basic groundwater licenses. There's also a lot of other unlicensed extractions, such as overland flows, floodplain harvesting, and stock and domestic uses of water. And there's a lot of legal loopholes and uncertainties. And the other problem with overall the top of this is the governance and auditing of all the data that the states actually put forward to the Murray Darling Basin Authority. There is no overall independent audit. There's a couple of audits that MDBA may do on certain areas at a time, but there used to be an audit team that went around and checked all the water diversion data, and that doesn't happen anymore. So again, the issue over governance over our water extraction data is a bit questionable. So in terms of in terms of one of the biggest areas going forward, I mean, I've talked to you about the problems of the policy of getting water back from the environment, how we are now at a standstill in terms of only subsidising irrigation infrastructure. Going forward, one of the biggest steps that will have to be done is the issue of cultural flows. So even with climate change and environmental rights, cultural rights are going to be the biggest issue, where it's going to be, we're going to have to worry about how do we reallocate water back to First Nation groups. So to date, there is very, very little First Nation involvement in owning water. It's been estimated in the latest paper of only to be about 0.04%. Even though $40 million after we saw Menindee in 2008 and the water scarcity and the fish kills that were happening there, there was $40 million allocated to buy water rights for Indigenous groups. It seems that not $1 has yet been allocated to do so. So going forward, you know, cultural water, cultural rights, reallocation back to First Nation groups is going to be something that's going to have to be considered a lot more. So that kind of brings me to conclusions right at the end, and I can see the chat seems to be going up. I can answer that at the end, but just for some broad water policy conclusions. So going forward, you know, there's going to have to be a reassessment of what environmental volumes we need, and then we need to account for climate change, and we will need to account for cultural flows. Now, there's been so many different inquiries, investigations, etc. This includes the Productivity Commission, the South Australian Murray Darling Basin Royal Commission, Australian Academy of Science recommendations. Hardly any of those recommendations have been actually enacted. So we know what to do, there is just not the political will to do it. In moving forward, I think there is absolutely no reason to move away from reverse auction open buyback tenders, i.e. buying water directly back from irrigators, towards subsidising irrigation infrastructure and supply projects. There's just no evidence that that is a better way of recovering water, and there's no evidence it's going to be better for the environment. I think we do need to account for water better. You know, we need to measure inflows. We need to understand water consumption. We need more scientific studies on return flows. And we need to understand how substitutability groundwater sources are for surface water. So there is going to be increased use of groundwater as we move forward, and that's definitely an issue. And a part of counting for water will be using remote sensing, satellite measurement, a lot more to actually measure if we don't have proper monitoring in place to measure water extractions across the basin. So as I mentioned, New South Wales, NRAR, they're leading the way in this. And the new interim Inspector General that's just been appointed in the last couple of months with the legislation going forward, this also may be very important in enforcing water compliance across the basin a lot more. We obviously need to account for climate change uncertainty in accounting, and we need to do a lot more auditing of all the current water programs. You know, in terms of all the money that's been spent on irrigation infrastructure, it's very, very difficult to understand where, when and how it's been spent, what has actually been achieved from it. So in terms of accountability and transparency, I believe a lot more will come out in the future about the corruption and potentially complete waste of money of those programs. So, I mean, finally, is valuing water to all areas of society. As a water economist, I fully believe that the more we understand what water means to all different parts of us, and the more we give a voice to all areas, then the more hopefully we can move towards a more sustainable society. So thank you. I'll go up to chat. So how would you like me to do it? Does everyone just want to actually ask their questions?
Well, I might start off because I've picked up a few from the chat. If you don't mind, I can ask on behalf of two that I picked out, and we could start off with them, and then as we go we can just collect more from the chat, or people can put their hand up and I'll invite them to unmute perhaps. But could we start, Steph Stewart raised a question a while back about the Coorong and the Murray Mouth, and your thoughts on what's happening there and how we can keep those areas the best that they can be under the current legislated, circumstances that we've got.
Yeah, well, it's difficult. So I mean, the Coorong needs more water. Is kind of the basic fundamental need of the Coorong, and it obviously needs not to be dredged as much to at least have a break of not being dredged. It's, you know, there's the old saying that rivers die from the mouth up, and what worries me is that we're seeing a lot of evidence for that occurring. So in terms of going forward, I mean, there's arguments that the barrages can be manipulated more to try and encourage greater flow of water out. I'm sure that's things that need to be looked at. Salinity measures, in terms of all the money that's being spent on the Coorong and the southeastern drains, I have to say I'm not a scientist to know enough of the potential of that and what might happen. All I know is that all the scientists are arguing about is it good or is it not good. So the clearest fact is that the Coorong needs more water. It needs more volume of water coming down the river, and all the other things, the barrage movement of barrages, the southeastern drains, the impact of salinity there, that's all other things that get argued about a lot. So I know that's not an answer. You almost need a Coorong expert to answer that one.
Thank you. No, that's terrific. And yeah, I sort of jumped straight into the questions, but I'd really like to thank you on behalf of our group and all the people on the line tonight for giving up your time to talk to us. It's really important and you know, vital stuff for us. Somebody noted that, yes, we are mostly in South Australia. We're a South Australian Adelaide-based group, but we've got people on the line from as far away as the Northern Territory and the Eastern States as well. So thank you to those people who've jumped in, and yeah, great talk, and thank you so much. Can I go on to just another question, which is a little bit further back, because we're getting some people putting questions in right now, but we don't want to miss the ones that were earlier. John has asked a question about soil quality, and I think he's talked about food waste from landfill is now being used more as composts, and whether that can help with improving the quality of land and farms. Is that something that is being done?
Well, it definitely is. I mean, I'm part of the CRC for food waste, and there's lots and lots of investigations going into that. Part of the problem for farms is the costs of transporting of mulch, so it's or food waste products, etc. So that's often one of the biggest issues that stops them using more compost, mulching, etc. on the farm. But part of the CRC for food waste is trying to set up other ways on farms and even within regions to kind of extend that sort of soil applications a lot more. So yeah. Thank you.
We've got a question here recently from Barb Pocock, who I think is with us tonight. Barbara, did you want to say hello and ask your question?
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks so much for making this happen. It's incredibly useful. And Sarah, thank you. So my question really is just born out of frustration, really, with economists and scientists so agreed, really. There aren't denialists out there. You know, everyone seems to be pretty strong that the quantum of environmental flows is not enough. Climate change isn't taken into account. You know, we need more, and the efficiency project is a fraud. Why is it not penetrating in the politics? Sorry, probably very unfair question, but
no, I mean, Barbara, well, you would know as well. I mean, this is something I worry about all the time, and I often think, how do I get my message across more? How do we make it more transparent? I mean, it comes down to, do we think politicians are becoming more corrupt? And I think there's probably evidence, not necessarily maybe that being more corrupt, but they're just not being held to the same set of standards, and they're getting away with more things. That's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is the fact that the perception has very much been captured by rural communities that the plan is destroying their communities. And it's very, very hard to argue against that, because all rational people don't want rural communities to be harmed. So you're immediately almost going out, whenever you start arguing to say it's not true, you're viewed as, well, for me, for example, I'm just an economic rationalist. I don't care about people. I don't care about rural communities. And it's really hard to get past that point. I mean, I think people, we try and do it, but it's just the agenda has been captured by certain people, and it's hard to get past that. And the only way I feel going forward, I mean, I'm a big believer in transparency and openness. Like I said, I think the more information that gets out there, the more that we can see that programs are wrought, the more that we can see that they're corrupt, the more that we can see that certain politicians are perhaps making money out of things that they shouldn't have made out of. Hopefully we can get change, but I just don't know. And whether I think that the going back to buyback will happen, even if it's shown that, you know, we have so much evidence that the environment is just falling apart. I don't know if we'll ever get back to buyback, or we just go to a situation where we're just going to cut everyone's water allocations across the board. You know, forget the idea of a plan, forget the idea of voluntary buyback and voluntary, you know, subsidising irrigation infrastructure. We just cut everyone across the board. That's probably the situation we're going towards, which you could cut everyone across the board and not compensate anyone. And by what I mean by that is, you know, you have, if someone has 100 megalitres of water, they have 100% entitlement, so they take 100 each year. If we say, no, climate change, everything's over allocated, to get back to balance, we need to decrease everyone's use, then, you know, you cut by 10% everyone. You could either do it and not compensate everyone, or you could say we're going to cut everyone 10% and send them a check, the value of that water at that point in time. That, I'm starting to think that might be the only way forward. It's almost like, instead of slowly ripping off a band-aid, which is what we've been doing with the current Murray Darling Basin Plan, the next big reform is just do it, just cut, send them a check and rip that band-aid off. But the only way that's going to work as well is if you're monitoring, making sure everyone is complying, if you've got all your governance in place, and that's also a big call.
Thank you very much. There's heaps of excellent questions here.
You know, they kind of, I'm trying to keep up. I'll let you pick them out.
Okay, Mandy's just posted, if the buybacks don't cause the damage to communities that some would have us believe, who benefits from this untruth, apart from the obvious? Yeah,
well, I mean, technically irrigators benefit, because apart from the fact that these programs are wasteful, inefficient, hurting the environment, irrigators who are getting the grants, who are getting the money, they're technically the ones benefiting from it in that sense. And yeah, some people have made millions and millions from the program. And I should say, when it's more likely to be the bigger irrigators than the smaller irrigators, because if you look at the paperwork of a lot of those irrigation infrastructure programs, and you know, it's like anything, you set up a program and some people wrought the system, and it's known that the bigger irrigators are doing more of the rorting.
Yeah. Just while I look through, I actually put a question myself early on, which is probably actually answered by some of your articles in the conversation, which I then looked up. But do you have any sense of what you think is likely to happen over the next 3 or 4 years and up until the next review in terms of trends and where we're headed?
I think that we are going to see more and more scientific articles coming out that show huge environmental issues. So I think there's going to be more evidence like that. I think 3 or 4 years, the probability is that we're, given the way climate change is happening, I think we'll be heading back into a drought. It might be in only some part of the basin, or it might be across the whole basin, but you know, we'll head back more into a drought. In that situation, I think will be water entitlement prices are going to skyrocket more. I think we're going to see increased use of groundwater entitlements and things such as much more pumping out groundwater. We're going to see increased use of desalination plants, even on farm, desalinating groundwater, increased use. So we're going to have increased extraction. Yeah, I worry about the direction we're going in. And all we can hope is that our governance, our monitoring, our compliance increases. I hope that New South Wales' use of satellite imagery to measure water extractions is adopted by other states, because then you'll start to hopefully get a much better idea of how much water is actually being extracted. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but that's...
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Excellent question here about shareholder activism. Is there a role for individuals and organisations to purchase water rights for the environment, something like people have done with forests and land that they don't want to be cleared? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Does it happen?
Yeah. It happens. So Healthy Rivers, there's the Healthy Rivers, they do that. The Nature Conservancy, they have a program, they're doing it. I mean, they also lease out their water allocations as well. There's, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the biggest move will probably be in the cultural space and First Nations, that area versus the environment, which has the Commonwealth Environment Holder and then state environment water holders. And there's probably, for activists, there's, you know, it's trying to hold people to account, and it's trying to hold governments to account, and government auditing of programs and demanding information on how our money is being spent. And yeah.
Excellent. I might just scroll back through the chat a bit, but just before I find the next question, I wanted to post a link which is to an article I found on the Environmental Defenders Office website about some small good news, I think, which is about boosting compliance. I wondered if you've seen this, Sarah, and if you have any views.
Is it by Emma Carmody by any chance? Yes. So Emma's a very good friend. So Emma is like the legal water expert, and I'm like the economic water expert. So we like collaborating. Emma is excellent. So if there was a legal question, I think you guys sent me about ombudsman. Yeah. So I don't think so, but I can ask Emma that question. The question was, is it worth going to the Commonwealth Ombudsman to complain that the Murray Darling Basin Authority is not doing their job properly, basically, and not conforming to the Water Act? I don't think the Ombudsman would take it on, mainly because water is so complicated. I think they would pass on it. Yeah. But I don't know. I'll ask Emma.
Thanks. I'm seeing lots of excellent comments here as well. Mandy's just posted something else. Mandy, would you like to unmute yourself?
Great. Hi, Sarah. Sarah, I was just wondering, apart from people like yourself, water economists, and people like Richard Beasley, whose book I just read recently, who are the main figures that you see are sort of holding the flag for the Murray Darling Basin and looking for changes at the moment, people that we could support or be in contact with? Is there much sort of action publicly?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so we talked about the Environment Defenders Office, Emma Carmody. So, you know, Environment Defenders Office, they do a great job. If it wasn't for them, they're the ones that, for example, Emma did, got up the Four Corners pumped episode. So, you know, a lot of us academics were, you know, we're just kind of yelling in the wind about, oh my God, you know, does everyone realize what's happening? Being completely ignored. And then Emma got the Four Corners pumped episode up, which showed the stealing of Commonwealth Environment water basically in the Darling. And because of that, there's so much reform and reports that then happen to then illustrate the issues that we've been saying about the lack of governance, the lack of monitoring, metering, enforcement. It led to the reform of the New South Wales water agencies, and you know, and it highlighted a lot of the corruption of the politicians that were going on. You know, so that's why I'm saying that Emma did such a great job with that. And if it hadn't been for that program, we never would have had all those inquiries, and we never would have had then the support to the academic voices that were there. In academia, Professor Richard Kingsford, he's an ecologist. He's basically been tracking and measuring ecological and environment systems in the basins for decades. So he knows very well what's happening with the environment. He's one of the most ethical and moral and smartest people that I know. So he's worth checking in on too. So, and I mean, ANU have a water group. They do a lot of work in this space. But it's hard being in the space that's always criticising government policy, because it doesn't make you very popular. So, you know, I've made a lot of enemies because I criticise government policy all the time. I've lost a lot of grant money and consulting money that, you know, and positions because of my public criticism of what's going on. And so it's not an easy space to be in if you're an academic.
Are there any politicians who you feel like are on side, or, you know, making the right noises to actually get things moving and get things changed?
Yeah, I mean, the independents and the Greens always do the best job they can, calling for information, calling for freedom of information requests, pulling out, you know, demanding transparency and openness. That's you know, the more you can get transparency and openness, the more you have enough evidence to show that someone's doing something wrong, or the policy is not behaving the way it should be. Doesn't mean you'll make a change, but my hope is just the more evidence will get to a point where you have to change. It's so obvious. We're not quite there yet. Yeah, but I mean, Labor are traditionally more sympathetic to the idea of a sustainable basin than the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party have always been having to work with the Nationals, and the Nationals just fully, well, they run with the argument that the Basin Plan is ruining rural communities.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really helpful.
There was some comments a bit further back in the chat about paying farmers or irrigators to actually leave their business, and sort of in the same vein as a just transition for fossil fuel workers. Do you think that's something that might be possible, and do you have a view on that?
Yes, so the idea of farmers exiting farms is not a new one. It's been around. There's a lot of programs around about a farm exit, and, you know, usually farm exit programs arise when you have a period of drought. So it might be part of a drought payment, you know, trying to encourage farmers to leave. Within the Millennium Drought, there was the small irrigator block exit package, and irrigated farms were encouraged to sell their water back to the government. and to exit irrigated farming. So they didn't necessarily have to exit their farm, they just had to exit irrigated farming and pull up all their irrigation infrastructure, which many of them did. In terms of, is this a good policy? I do think exit packages have to be part of a total agricultural kind of drought policy. I do think that we can't sustain, especially irrigation farmers, we can't sustain as many irrigation farmers as we do. And we also have to remember that, suicide in rural communities, it's considerably higher than many other areas. So I'm, for example, I'm doing work at the moment that we're looking at the impact of drought and temperature on rural suicide. And the fact is, severe drought increases suicide rates in rural communities considerably. That's holding everything else constant. So that's work that I'm hoping that we'll finish soon. So what I'm trying to say is that in an era of climate change, in an era of water scarcity, these are all situations that are causing immense problems for farmers. Now, if we want to try and design the best policy we can to get water back to the environment, we have to try and look after our farmers in the meantime. But looking after our farmers is not subsidising irrigation infrastructure and locking them into a system that's unsustainable. So we either have to look at alternative ways to get the money on the farm if they're not traditionally using water for irrigated produce, or we have to think that they can't be farming anymore and we have to transition them out of farming. So exit packages play one role in that, but they're just one role that's coupled with other services, which might be having carbon markets in place, having prices, dealing with climate change, improving risk management, having alternative crops, lots of different things we have to do if we want to reduce rural suicide, if we want farmers to adapt, if we want healthy communities.
Thank you. Another thing that I really wanted to hear about a little bit tonight, I mean, the overview of what's happening with the Murray Darling Basin Plan and its history was really terrifically useful to me, I think. But I know that you've spent some time looking at farmers' attitudes and beliefs about climate change as well. And I know we don't have time for a whole nother lecture, but do you have time to touch on that for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I mean, I think farmers' attitudes to climate change is really important, mainly because of their influence on the National Party and National Party's influence on Australian climate change policy, which is pretty bad. So, I said, and also I'm interested in trying to understand what farmers think about climate change, about how it influences what they then do on their farm, and are they being prepared for what's coming? Because that's what scares me, the what's coming, the increased droughts, the reduced rainfall and increased temperatures. So generally what we found, that's why we've actually included climate change questions on many surveys we've done of irrigators over time. So I've probably surveyed, in the last decade, I've probably talked to over 10,000 irrigators and surveyed them. So what we know over time is that even though irrigators are much less likely than the general public to A, believe climate change is happening, or B, believe that it's human-caused climate change, we also know that they are gradually changing their mind and increasing, starting to believe that climate change is playing a risk on their farm. So, over a 5-year period, we tracked from 2000 to 2015. It increased significantly from, low 30% of farmers believing climate change was happening to up towards 50%. So that was a positive thing. And we also then because they started believing that climate change was happening, did that then influence what they were doing on their farm? And we found that it did.
Thank you. Excellent. We're getting a lot of great comments. And thanks for you and the work that you're doing, and admiration for, you know, the really tough position that you are in between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. If there's anybody who would like to ask a question without typing, I might invite you to put your hand up perhaps, or just wave at me. Can I see anybody?
Mandy's waving.
Oh, Mandy, excellent. Go, Mandy.
From you.
Great. Sarah, given that the Water Act is actually a law, is there any legal action, you know, that can be taken by an environmental group against people who haven't put the environment first, you know, when they've made decisions about, you know, the water that goes back into the Murray and things like that? Again, reading Richard Beasley's book, he was very much on that point, that the Water Act is a law, and what's been happening is illegal. Has anyone tried, you know, legal avenues to try and change things, or, you know, get more water for downstream, you know, to make sure that the environment's put first over, you know, economic and social concerns, which is how the Act was written?
Yes, well, I mean, Emma Carmody from Environment Defender's Office would be best to answer this question. And there are, the EDO, I know, have tried a number of things, but I also know that they have limited resources, so they're very, very careful about what they do try to take to court. In terms of other groups, there is the Southern Irrigators. Oh, I can't quite remember their proper term, but there is an irrigator group that is taking to court the authority and challenging them, not so much for environmental reasons, but the Southern Irrigators are within the Southern Murray Darling Basin, and they're quite angry with what's happening in the Northern Murray Darling Basin, and they believe that because of water policy and water allocations are not being properly treated in the Northern Basin, that's then impacting on their own water allocations in the Southern. And there is some support for their view, because South Australia has a set 1850 kind of gigalitres that they get from the River Murray, and then if it's not coming from Murray sources or Darling sources, then they have to get it from the Murray. So in that sense, the whole basin is interlinked. So the Southern Irrigators are trying to sue the authority for not properly doing their job properly in the Northern Basin, because it's impacting on the Southern. But yes, it's not expected that court action is going to be successful. That's what I've been told. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so it gets very, very complicated.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to complement what Mandy was asking. So, sorry, this is Samantha here. So in terms of that question that was raised just then, so Susan Lay, there's that action recently with, I think it was Sharma versus, was it the Environment Department? So that's on Whitehaven Coal, I think it is. That's where a federal judge has sort of said that the federal minister has a responsibility to future generations in terms of climate change. Could that sort of angle in terms of the impact of future generations in terms of water use, like, is that an angle that's at all possible under the EPBC Act or any other kind of legislative, you know, something that you could just, you know, I feel in this space, every sort of angle possible seems to be sort of, you know, what I think different community groups are trying to work with while we are in such a politicized environment. Anyway, that's just a general thought bubble to put out there.
You know, no, Sam, I think it's a good idea. That case, as far as I know, was run by the Environment Defender's Office. I'm pretty sure I saw it was attributed to them. So if it was possible, I think EDO, and if it was possible and they thought they would win and they perhaps had a funder, I'm sure they would go with it.
I would love to organise a talk on climate litigation and where we're at in Australia and the world. I'd love that to put that on our agenda for future talks. So stay tuned. We'll hopefully we can get maybe even someone like Emma from the EDO to come and talk to us.
Particularly since Gabby works for the EDO.
I do, only a tiny amount though. I'm very far down the food chain.
She's everywhere.
I am. I know we are coming to probably the end of our time soon, but Carol's mentioned feedlots and the way cattle are farmed. Do you have thoughts or recommendations about what we can do as consumers to support more environmentally friendly diet?
Yeah, yep, good question. I mean, it's not my direct level of expertise, apart from, you know, I do a lot of work in organic farming, so and some work in regenerative agriculture. So, you know, there's obviously some forms of agriculture that have very strict rules in terms of you know, use of chemicals, fertilizers, but also in terms of animal rights and treatment, etc. So, you know, it's consumers can make choices about what they're buying. Minimizing meat obviously is also one way of kind of more doing a climate change diet. But yeah, that would just be my recommendations.
Mandy, go.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah. Oh, just one last question. You were talking before about the Ramsar sites along the accredited wetlands. I'm not quite sure if accreditation is the right word, but they have international status, don't they? Those wetlands. Yeah. Are there any ramifications for? I'm just thinking of the Great Barrier Reef incident recently. But are there any ramifications if those wetlands start to significantly suffer and that's noticed internationally? Is there likely to be any sort of action internationally that might, you know, give us a bit of a kick up the bum, I suppose, in terms of the amount of water we're putting into the river there?
Yes, there is. I know, again, I'm dobbing Emma in here. She's actually on the advisory board of the Ramsar list, some advisory board that deals with Ramsar listed wetlands. There is, yeah, I don't know it exactly. All I know is that she has looked at that legislation and she thinks there is some link potential there. But in terms of the detail, I could not tell. I haven't read anything about it in detail.
Thanks.
Anybody else would like to ask a question without typing? If not, I've got another one. I'm full of questions. I can't see anyone waving, so oh, sorry, John, you're on page 2. Yes, go.
That's all right. Actually, don't pick on Emma. We've got our own insider, Gabby. Blame her. Not a question, just a comment.
Okay. My question was about something you mentioned sort of midway through the talk about you think that you said you think that one of the first positive avenues we might have for change is around cultural water and increasing that. Could you maybe just talk a little bit more about that and where we might be able to help as activists?
Yeah, I think it's about just raising awareness of Indigenous rights to water. So obviously, you know, we've had Indigenous rights to land, and as part of that legislation, it does include the water that runs over the land, but that's actually completely different. Really, it's never been tested within the Murray Darling Basin situation, and no water has ever been associated with land to Indigenous rights at the moment. And I mean, the Darling River is a classic example of the close link between the river and Indigenous communities that depend on many elements of the Darling River. So it's argued, so the Darling now, which is drying up considerably, a lot more than it ever has, but it's argued that the Indigenous communities, pretty much everything goes wrong when there's no water in the river. I mean, I would love to see some more quantitative research in this space, but it's argued, you know, that crime goes up in these small Indigenous communities. Crime goes up, domestic violence increase, hospitalizations increase, health problems get worse, mental health, suicide gets worse. You know, anything you can think of that's bad kind of gets worse if there's no water in the river. So the link between water and well-being is very, very important. So then, you know, that comes down to how do we keep water in the river? How do we there's that question, but then there's also the question of rights to water and how best to do that. You know, do we treat it exactly the same as how we've been acting within the Murray Darling Basin Plan in terms of buying water back from irrigators and giving it to Indigenous groups in an over-allocated situation? Obviously, some reallocation has to happen. In situations such as the Northern Territory, where you have water resources that are currently being allocated out to groups, that's a perfect scenario where we should be saying, hang on, before we give out licenses to, you know, big irrigation companies, we should make sure that Indigenous groups have the rights to water. Now, what they choose to do with that water is their choice, but, you know, whether they use it for the environment or if they use it for businesses or they use it even to trade temporary water, that's their choice. But it's in the design of the system. So in terms of what groups can do, you know, it's about highlighting information. I mean, if you had money, and I know no one ever has money, I mean, you actually could set up buying water for cultural purposes, but then it's working out how best, what group are you going to give it to, all those sort of things.
It gets pretty complex because that's also, sorry, Samantha again, because then you start talking about song lines. So that comes up with fracking, for example, with groundwater. And some of those companies would like to say, oh, it's just this particular area rather than that particular area, but it's all connected, interconnected underneath. There are cultural obligations, not just to what's on the surface, but what's below as well. So injecting poisons into water or whatever that activity is, it's not just an impact in one area, it flows literally and metaphorically through so many areas. So it is a collective discussion for our communities as well. And it's really interesting, just some of the, like one of the inquiries that's taking place at the moment on fracking, where geoscience or scientists have said, oh, or the question has been asked by a senator about whether or not the aquifers are linked. And on the one hand, you've got science in an area that's saying, oh, no, they're not linked. But then you've got groups that are saying, well, no, actually, we know historically through our traditional knowledge that it is. And so there's these huge, and just to even how at this point, we're still separating out what is knowledge and what is science and still discounting our history that way is really, there's so much to unpack. Yeah, that's all I'll say there.
No, I think that's some great comments there. I mean, yeah, in terms when you talked about things linked and traditional owners say it's linked and scientists say that, I think that's so right. I think there's so much we don't know about our water resources, and we've literally only scratched the surface. So trying to join up traditional knowledge with, you know, Western knowledge is so important.
Thank you. John just posted a link there to a court case, a class action against the Murray Darling Basin Authority. John, did you want to say something about that quickly? We probably need to wrap in a few minutes, but. Are you there, John?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, no, look, I just did a quick bit of search to find that link, so I don't know much more about than what was just disclosed. So I thought it might be of interest to the participants.
Thank you.
No problems.
There's some really great links in this meeting chat. I'll try and do a really good email follow up to those people who are here tonight for whom I have email addresses. I'll send the conversation articles and some of the other interesting stuff that was added to the chat by various people. We will have also the recording of this talk up on our YouTube channel in a few days in case you'd like to share it with friends. Presuming that's okay, Sarah, we'll chat about that later. Or if you want to just catch up on what you missed, I can make it also just access for selected people. So let's say we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left. So if anyone's got a final question, let's have one more. Otherwise, we might do a big round of applause and have a glass of something nice, perhaps. No final questions?
Water.
Of water, yeah. Delicious Murray River water. That's excellent. Yes, we could do a screenshot actually. That would be quite nice. I might quickly take one because it's great to see so many people on. Here we go. Ready, set, go. Smile. Yay. Done. I might just also put in the meeting chat, if I can find it very quickly, a link to some information about Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, just for people who haven't come to our talks before. We are a very small, very grassroots group in Adelaide. We survive on donations. Hopefully those links will work there. And we would love to have more supporters if anybody is keen to support what we're doing. And finally, I'd just really like to thank you to Sarah for a really, really interesting and important talk, and a great one to finish this, this little group of sessions that we've had over this past winter on. And we will have more excellent talks in the future for you. We don't have any programs right now, but we would please love you to stay in touch. And for those people who are going to be in Adelaide in January 2022, we'll be having a terrific 2-day workshop on designing a job guarantee, which is like a participatory forum, so you can come and take part and hear from excellent speakers and help us talk together about what a job guarantee would look like. So
and maybe Melbourne before then.
Oh yeah, we may also be holding our Rethinking Capitalism workshop in Melbourne. I'm looking at their COVID numbers with increasing sadness, but that's on in October, the 23rd and 24th of October, I think it is. So if you're in Melbourne, drop me a line about that. You will not regret going to that. We've run 3 sessions in Adelaide, and we've taken nearly 150 people through that 2-day workshop, and people come out of it feeling like they're empowered to talk about economics in a global scale, and also, you know, what we want for our future. Rethinking Capitalism, it's called. So that's the end of me plugging stuff. Let's all do a round of applause for Sarah. Thank you so much. We've got a gift for you that I will drop off at the uni if you're still in your office.
Thank you. No need.
And yeah, thank you so much. And I'll stop the recording. Ready? There we go.